Anti-Machiavel is an 18th-century essay by Frederick the Great, King of Prussia and patron of Voltaire, consisting of a chapter-by-chapter rebuttal of the Prince, the 16th-century book by Niccolò Machiavelli. It was first published in September 1740, a few months after Frederick became king. 1. https://wiki/wiki/Machiavel. Chapter XX are the fortresses, and several other things which the princes often use, are beneficial, or harmful. You might want to read chapter 20 of The Prince first. Paganism represented jaws with two faces. This meant perfect knowledge of all that has passed, and of the future. The image of this god, taken in an allegorical or mythical direction, very well applies to the princes. They must, like jaws, see behind them in the history of all these centuries which have passed, and which provide them salutary lessons of control and having, and they must, like jaws, see ahead by their penetration, and this spirit of force and judgment which combines all the reports and all the statistics, and divines, in the present situation, that which will, or might, follow. Machiavel proposes 5 questions for the princes, especially those which have made new conquests, those whose policy only requires strengthening their possession. It seems directed at counseling hooligans to become more prudent, to combine the past with the future, and to become the servant of reason and justice. Here the first question: should a prince disarm conquered people, or not? It is always necessary to correct Machiavel by explaining how much the manner of making war has changed since he wrote The Prince. Now, always disciplined armies, more or less strong, defend the countries. One would scorn a troop of armed peasants. Sometimes the citizens take up the weapons, and the professionals do not suffer because of it, to prevent any temptation to revolt. One threatens them with the bombardment and the cannon, the whiff of grape shot. It appears prudent to disarm the middle-class men of a conquered city, especially if one has something to fear from them. The Romans, who had conquered Great Britain, and who could not hold it in peace because of the turbulent and quarrelsome mood of these people, tried to euphemize them, in order to moderate their belligerent and savage instincts, hoping to succeed as in Rome itself. The Corsicans are a people as brave and as stout-hearted as these English. They will be overcome, I believe, only by prudence and kindness. To maintain the sovereignty of this island, it appears to me to be essential to disarm the inhabitants, and to soften their manners. I say in passing that one can see from the example of the Corsicans, whose courage and virtue gives to the men their love of freedom, that it is dangerous and unjust to oppress. The second question rolls on the confidence which a prince must have in his subjects after having become master of a new state, or in those of his new subjects which helped give him the principality, and even in those of which he is their legitimate prince. If you take a city by intelligence, and by the treason of some citizens, it would be very imprudent to trust the traitors, who probably will betray you. One must suppose that those which were faithful to their former masters, will also be so to their new sovereigns, because they are ordinarily wise spirits, settled men who have a stake in the country, who like order and see any change as harmful. One should not, however, give one's trust lightly to anybody. But let us suppose one moment that people who are oppressed, and are forced to shake off the yoke of their tyrants, call another prince to control them, I believe that the prince must answer with the same confidence that they showed him, and that if he treats those who entrust him with suspicion, it would be a most unworthy ingratitude which they would not miss seeing, nor would it fade from their memory. William, Prince of Orange, kept until the end of his life his friendship and his confidence with those who had put in his hands the reins of government of England, and those which were opposed to him, exiled themselves from their fatherland, and followed King James. In the elective kingdoms, where the majority of the electors are little more than brigands, and where the throne is venal, I agree with what some say, that the new sovereign should, after his rise, slip a pay off to those who were opposed to him, as this has in fact worked with these electors. Poland provides us examples of this. The transactions surrounding the throne are so venal that it seems that this purchase is done at the public markets. The King of Poland, by opening his purse, draws from his path any opposition. He is the master who sways the great families by palatiats, strophes and other gifts which he confers. But the Poles, like others, have on this subject of the benefits a very short memory, so it is necessary to water the plants often. In a word, the Republic of Poland is like the barrels of the Dides' daughters, condemned to eternal labor for killing their husbands at their father's orders. The most generous king will vainly spread his benefits on them, and will never satisfy them. However, though a king of Poland has many favors to grant, he can spare his resources by concentrating his liberalities only on the occasions where he needs the families which he enriches. The third question of Machiavel properly looks at the security of a prince in a hereditary kingdom, if it is better that he maintains union or discord among his subjects. This question could perhaps be relevant in the time of the ancestors of Machiavel in Florence. But in the present I do not think that any prince has adopted any rising rather than mitigating it. I would have only to quote the beautiful, so-known apology of Marcus Agrippa, by which he joins together the Roman people. The republics, however, must in some way maintain the jealousy between their members, because if no second party watches over the first, the shape of the government changes into monarchy. There are princes who believe that the disunion of their ministers is necessary for their interests. They think of being misled by a united band of men whose mutual hatred serves as the prince's bodyguard, but if these hatreds produce this effect, they produce also a dangerous strength. If these ministers have to contribute to the service of the prince, they will be thwarted continuously, and they will confuse their particular quarrels with the advantage of the prince and the safety of the people. Nothing thus contributes any more has the force of a monarchy than the union intimate and inseparable from all its members, and it must be the goal of a prince wise to establish it. What I have just answered for the third question of Machiavel, can to some extent be used as a solution to his fourth problem. Let us examine, however, and judge in 2 words, if a prince must foment factions against himself, or if he must gain the friendship of his subjects. A prince forges monsters when he fights his subjects, even only a small group of them. This is to be done to the enemies of his country, to overcome them. It is more natural, more reasonable, more human to make friends. Happy are the princes who know the softnesses of friendship. Happier are those who deserve the love and affection of their people. Where is the justice in the opposite course? We now reach the last question of Machiavel, if a prince must have fortresses and citadels, or if he must get rid of them. I believe I have disclosed my feeling in the 10th chapter for what would work for the small princes. Let us come now to what helps the control of the kings. In the time of Machiavel the world was in a general fermentation. The spirit of sedition and of revolt reigned everywhere. One saw only factions and tyrants. Frequent revolutions made princes build citadels on the heights of the cities, to contain the anxious spirit of the more surly inhabitants. For a barbarian century, where the men grow weary of destroying each other or where the sovereigns have in their states a more despotic capacity, one need not speak any more about seditions and revolts, and one would say that the rising of the spirit, after having worked enough of its magic, becomes quiet. A prince has no more need for citadels to ensure the fidelity of the cities and country. It is not these kind of fortifications which will guard against a prince's enemies, and will ensure the strength of the state. The armies and the fortresses are of equal use for the princes, because if they can oppose their armies to their enemies, they can save this army under the gun of their fortresses in the event of a lost battle, and if the enemy besieges this fortress, this gives them time to regroup and assemble new forces, that they can still, if they pile up them in time, employ to besiege the enemy. The last wars in Flanders, between the Emperor and France, almost became trench warfare. Because of the multitude of the fortified towns, and of the battles of 100,000 men, gained over 100,000 men, were followed only by the capture of 1 or 2 cities. The adversary fled to the countryside, and gained time to repair its losses. Then, the enemy reappeared again, and quickly called into question last year's victory. In countries where there are many fortified towns, the armies which cover 2 ground miles will be at war for 30 years, and will gain, if they are lucky, for price of 20 battles, 10 miles of ground. In open countries, the outcome of 2 campaigns decides the fortune of the winner, and subjects whole kingdoms to him. Alexander, Caesar, Genghis Khan, Charles XII prolonged their glory so long as they found few fortified places in the countries which they conquered. The winner of India made only 2 sieges in his glorious shifts. The arbiter of Poland never made any more. Eugene, Villars, Marlborough, Luxembourg, were great captains, but the fortresses blunted the brilliance of their successes. The French know the utility of the fortresses well, because from the Brabant to the Dauphiné it is like a double chain of fortified towns. The east border of France on the side of Germany is like the opened mouth of a lion, which presents 2 lines of menacing teeth, a mouth that will swallow all invading troops. This should be enough to show the use of fortified towns. Chapter 21, How the Prince must control himself for him to be held in regard. You might want to read chapter 21 of The Prince first. This chapter of Machiavel contains both good and bad. I will raise the faults of Machiavel, I will confirm his observations which are good and creditable, and I will then venture my feeling on some subjects which belong naturally to this matter. The author proposes the example of Ferdinand of Aragon, and Bernard of Milan, as a model for those who want to be characterized by grand enterprises, and rare and extraordinary actions. Machiavel seeks the marvel in the boldness of the enterprises, and in the speed of the execution. That is great, I can say honestly, but is creditable only in proportion as the enterprise of the conqueror is right. If you win praise by exterminating the robbers, said the Scythian ambassadors to Alexander, you then yourself become the largest robber of the earth, because you plundered and ransacked all the nations which you overcame. If you are a god, you must do good for the mortals, and not plunder what they have title to. If you are a man, always remember it. Ferdinand of Aragon was not always satisfied to make war openly. He found his religion useful, like a veil, to cover his intentions. He misused the faith of the sermons. He spoke only about justice, and made only injustices. This is what Machiavel praises him for. Machiavel pleads in the second place the example of Bernard of Milan, to insinuate to the princes that they must reward and punish in an inspired way, so that all their actions have a character of grandeur. The generous princes will not harm their reputation, especially when their liberality is a continuation of the size of their soul, and not of their self-righteousness. The kindness of their hearts can make them larger than all the other virtues. Cicero said to Caesar, "You do not have anything larger in your fortune than the capacity to save citizens as well, nor worthier of your kindness as the will to do it." It would thus be necessary that the sorrows that a prince inflicts always spring from an offense, and that the rewards which he gives are always a reward of service. But here is a contradiction. The doctor of policy wants in this chapter for his princes to hold their alliances, and in the 18th chapter he formally released them from their word. He becomes as a teller of great adventures who says white to the ones, and black to the others. If Machiavel reasons badly on all that we have just said, he speaks well of the caution which the prince must have when dealing with other princes who are more powerful, who, instead of helping him, could be his destroyer. It is what every prince of Germany knows, and what the large one uses to estimate his friends and enemies. The Swedes entered Germany's states, when its troops were at rest, to help the emperor with the bottom of the Rhine in the war which he supported against France. The ministers of this prince, after giving the news of this sudden eruption, advised him to call the Tsar of Russia for help, but this prince, more penetrating than them, answered that the Muscovites were as bears, better for them to wear their chains, rather than give them to others. He generously took on himself the responsibility of revenge, and he did not take the path of repentance. If I lived in a future century, I would surely lengthen this article with some reflections which could agree with Machiavel, but is not for me to judge the policies of the modern princes. In the world it is necessary to both know how to speak and how to keep silent. The matter of neutrality is as well treated by Machiavel as that of the engagements of the princes. Experience showed for a long time that a neutral prince exposes his country to the insults of the two warring factions, that his states become the theater of the war, and that he always loses by neutrality, without ever having anything solid to gain there. There are two manners by which a prince can become great. One is that of the conquest, where a warlike prince moves back by the force of his weapons the limits of his domination. The other is that of a good government, when a hard prince makes flower in his states all arts and all sciences, which return to him both matured and more organized. All this book is filled only with advice geared to the first manner of increasing power. Let us say something of the second, more innocent, just, and quite as useful as the first. The arts most necessary to life are agriculture, trade and manufactures. Those which show the most honor to the human spirit are mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, the eloquence, poetry, painting, music, sculpture, architecture, engraving, and what one hears being given the name of beautiful arts. As the countries vary infinitely, there are those whose strength is in agriculture, others in the grape harvest, others in manufactures, and others in trade. These arts can even thrive together in some countries. The sovereigns who will choose this soft and pleasant manner to increase their power will be obliged to study mainly the culture of their country, in order to know which of these arts will be cleanest and thus has to be pushed, and consequently which they must encourage more. The French and the Spaniards realized that they missed out on trade, and they thus ruminated, for this reason, on the means of ruining that of the English. If they succeed, France will increase its power more considerably than it could not have done by the conquest of 20 cities and 1,000 villages, and England and Holland, these two most beautiful countries and the richest of the world, would decay imperceptibly, as a patient who dies of consumption. The countries whose corn, silk and vines are riches have two things to observe. One is to clear all the grounds carefully, in order to work the least ground with profit. The other is to make easier the flow of goods, cheapening the means of transporting these goods, which will make the same goods cheaper. As for manufactures of all species, it is perhaps the most useful and advantageous for a state, since by them the nation can provide for the needs and the luxury of the inhabitants, and the neighbors are even obliged to pay tribute to your industry. This makes the money of the country strong, and invite more funds into the country. I have always convinced myself that the deficit of manufactures had partly caused these extraordinary emigrations from the countries of the north, these Goths, these Vandals, who so often flooded the southernmost countries. In these moved back times a person not knowing the arts in Sweden, Denmark, and in most of Germany, engages in agriculture or hunting. The arable lands were shared between a certain number of owners, who cultivated them, and whom they could nourish. But because the human race from time immemorial has often played second fiddle in these cold climates, there has been times where twice more inhabited a country that it could support by tilling, and the young men from good homes emigrated and became mercenaries. They were famous brigands by need. They devastated other countries, and dispossessed some of the masters. Therefore, one sees in the Byzantine Empire, and in the Exide, these barbarians asking only for ordinary fields to cultivate, in order to provide for their subsistence. The countries of the north are not less people now than then, but as the desire for luxury has very wisely multiplies our needs, the brigadry has turned into to manufacturing, and these arts keep the whole peoples alive, ones which otherwise would be obliged to seek their subsistence elsewhere. These manners of making a state thrive, are like the entrusted talents. The wisdom of the sovereign must be to put them forward, not push them backward. The surest mark that a country is under a wise and happy government, is when beautiful arts are born in its center. In fact, flowers bloom in a fatty ground and under a happy sky. The dryness, or the breath of the north winds, makes them die. History illustrates more one reign where the arts flowered under its shelter. The century of Pericles is more famous for the great geniuses which lived in Athens, than by the battles that the Athenians gave its princes. The reign of Augustus is better known for Cicero, Ovid, Horace, Virgil, etc., that by the prescriptions of this cruel emperor, who won, after all, most of his reputation, thanks to the pen of Horace. The kingdom of Louis XIV is more famous for the school of Correille, the Racines, Molière, Boileau, Descartes, the Lébrus, Girardot, than by this passage of the Rhine. Exaggerated so much by the sieges where Louis was in person, and by the Battle of Turin that Mr. de Martin lost with the Duke of Orleans by command of the cabinet. Kings honor humanity when they distinguish and reward those who are to him men of honor, and when they encourage these higher spirits which drive themselves to improve our knowledge, and who are devoted to the worship of the truth. Happy are the sovereigns who cultivate these sciences for themselves, who think like Cicero. This Roman consul, the liberator of his fatherland and father of the eloquence, in this way, the study of the belles lettres form the character of youth, and bring charm to those of advanced age. Prosperity is made more brilliant, and adversity receives consolations from them, and in our houses, and those of the others, in the voyages and the loneliness, in any time and in all places, they are the civilizer of our life. Lorenzo de Medici, the great man of his nation, was the peacemaker of Italy, and the restorer of the sciences. His property reconciled to him the general confidence of all the princes, and Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest emperors of Rome, was not less the happy warrior than the wise philosopher, and joined the most severe practice of morals to the profession that can forge them. Let us stop by these words: a king that justice has laid, has the world for his temple, and people of the good are his priests and sacrificers. Chapter 22, Secretaries of the Princes. You might want to read chapter 22 of The Prince first. There are two species of princes in the world, those which see all by their own eyes, and control their states by themselves, and those who rest on the good faith of their ministers, and hand off some control to those who are inspired by the prince's spirit. The sovereigns of the first species are like the heart of their states, the weight of their government rests on them only, like the world on the back of Atlas, they regulate the interior businesses like the foreign ones, they fill at the same time the stations of first magistrates of justice, of generals of the armies, of the nation's treasurers. They have, with the example of God, who uses himself genius higher than that of man to operate his commands, spirits that are both penetrating and tough, to carry out their intentions and to fill in detail what they envisioned. Their ministers are, properly, instruments in the hands of wise and skillful master. The sovereigns of the second command like are plunged, by a defect of this spirit, yes by a natural indolence, into a lethargic indifference. If the state, close to falling into failure by the weakness of the sovereign, must be supported by the wisdom and the promptness of a minister, the prince then becomes a necessary phantom, because he represents the state, all that he does is wish. And this makes for an agreeable style of rulership. It is not that easy for a sovereign to look further into the character of those potential ministers he wants to employ in the businesses as it is to advise such a course, because the parties have as much facility for self-disguise in front of their masters that the princes have in unmasking them. They are very good at dissimulating the interior of their souls with their public image, and the best ones just might have gotten their skills from a book known as The Prince. After all, if Sixthkind could mislead 70 cardinals who should have known better, how much, with stronger reasons, easier is it for a private individual to surprise the sovereign who missed an occasion to penetrate his disguise. A prince of spirit can judge, without sorrow, the talents and the capacity of those who serve him, but it is almost impossible for him to judge well their degree of disinterest and their fidelity. It was often seen that men, due to change of circumstances, contradict itself, but so do those who give up their honesty and virtue when put to the test. One did not speak badly in Rome about Tiberius, of Nero, of Caligula, before they won the throne. Perhaps their amorality would have remained without effect, if it had not been called forth by the occasions which developed the germ of their spite. We know of men who join to their spirit and proven talents the most ungrateful flexibility, and other talents known to the darkest soul, and we know of others which have all the good qualities of the heart. The prudent princes usually give preference to those whose qualities of the heart prevail, to employ them in the governing of their country. They also preferred, on the contrary, to use those who have more flexibility as diplomats, to make use of them in negotiations. Because it is not absolutely urgent to maintain the command and justice in their states, it is enough to trust in honesty, and if it is necessary to persuade the neighbors and to forge intrigues, it is known well that probity is not as necessary in the foreign service as the rhetoric and sensitivity. It seems to me that a prince cannot reward fidelity enough for those which serve him with zeal. There is a certain feeling of justice in us which leads us to this recognition, and which should be followed. But the general interest requires absolutely that the princes reward with as much generosity as they punish with leniency, because the ministers who realize that the virtue will be the instrument of their fortune, will not have recourse to the crime, and they will naturally prefer the benefits of their master to foreign corruptions. The way of justice and the wisdom of the world thus agree perfectly on this subject, and it is completely imprudent to put this principle of attachment of ministers to a test that would be dangerous. Some princes give in to another dangerous defect: they change the ministers whimsically, and they punish with too much rigor the least irregularity of their obedience. The ministers who work immediately under the eyes of the prince, when they are some time in this place, could not completely disguise their defects to him. The more penetrating the prince is, the more easily he seizes them. The sovereigns who are not philosophical, who are impatient and want instant results, revolt against the weaknesses of those which serve them, and then they disgrace them, and lose them. The princes who reason more deeply, know the men better. They know that they all are marked with the stigmata of humanity, that there is nothing perfect in this world, that the great qualities are, so to speak, equilibrated by great defects, and that the man of genius must benefit from all. This is why, if they are relatively incorruptible, they preserve their ministers with their good and their bad qualities, and they prefer those who are known thoroughly to the new ones that they could have. It is like a band of skillful musicians, who are see enough to play with instruments which they know the strengths and weaknesses of, rather than inviting in new ones whose specific talents are unknown. Chapter 23, How the Flattering Ones Should Be Avoided. You might want to read chapter 23 of The Prince first. There is not a book of morals, nor a book of history, where the weakness of the princes for flattery is not harshly censured. It is always urged that the kings like and seek the truth. One wants that their ears are accustomed to hear it, and one is right, but one still wants, according to the habits of men, the little contradictory things. One wants that the princes have enough self-esteem to like glory, to enact great designs, and that at the same time they must be completely indifferent to the wages of their work, and to the benefits the same principle must push them to both deserve the praise and to scorn it. This is to ask much of humanity. The criterion for honor is that they must be able more which on the others. Contemptus virtutis ex contemptu fame, contemptible talk breeds a contemptible character. The princes which were insensitive to their reputation were only the indolent, or the voluptuous abandoned to their weakness. They was composed of cheap matter which no virtue animated. It is true that very cruel tyrants liked the praise, but it was in the melodious vanity, a vice. They wanted the esteem because they deserved the opposite. In the vicious princes, the flattery is a mortal poison which multiplies the seeds of their corruption. In the princes of merit, the flattery is as a rust which sticks to their glory, and which decreases the shine of it. A man of spirit revolts against the coarse flattery, he pushes back the flattering awkward one. Here is another kind of flattery, the sophistry of the weakest link. A real ruler's rhetoric decreases it. The prince of merit provides arguments for the higher passions, which gives the character of justice to austerity, and turns liberality into platitude, the two that are so often confused. He sublimates the vices of violation into recreation and honest pleasure. This amplifies especially the defects of the other kind of men, and quietly awards a trophy to those of sterling character. The majority of the men give in to the flattery which justifies their tastes, and which is not a complete he. They cannot really punish him who says himself to them the good of which they themselves are convinced. The flattery which is based on a solid basis is the most subtle of all. It is necessary to understanding this kind very well, to see the nuance which it adds to the truth. It will not be the kind that comes from poet-historians. It will not honor him with operas whose melody is hyperbole, having insipid forewords and epistles very crawling. It will not daze the hero by a bombastic account of his victories, but it will take the air of feeling. It will slip the flattery in delicately. It will appear honest and naive, perhaps childlike. How could a great man, a hero, how could a prince of such small spirit be annoyed by the speaking of a truth which the promptness of a friend seems to let escape? How could a Louis XIV, who felt that his supreme aloneness impressed men, and who took pleasure in this superiority, be annoyed against an old officer who speaks with trembled and stuttering tongue, and, stopping in the middle of his speech, says to his king, at least, Lord, I do not tremble in front of your enemies? The princes who were men before becoming kings, can remind themselves of what they were, and do not accustom themselves so easily with the condiments of the flattery. Those who have reigned all their life were always nourished by these spices, like the gods, and they would die of lethargy if all praises are taken away. It would thus be more accurate, it seems to me, to feel sorry for the kings rather than to condemn them. They face the flattering ones, and more than them still, the slanderers, who deserve the judgment and the hatred of the public, just as the enemy princes, who also disguise the truth to them, do. It is mandatory for one to distinguish the flattery from the praise. Trajan was encouraged in his virtue by the commendations of Pliny, but Tiberius was confirmed in his vices by the flatteries of the senators. And it is the job of a prince to distinguish which is which, without seeing the answer later in his history books. Chapter Exiv, Why the Princes of Italy Lost Their States. You might want to read chapter 24 of The Prince first. The fable of Cadmus, who sowed the teeth of the dragon that he had just overcome, and from which he reaped warriors who destroyed themselves, is emblematic of what were the Italian princes of the time of Machiavel. The perfidies and the treasons, passed along from one to the other, ruined them all. This is what you see in the history of Italy from the end of the 14th century until the beginning of the 15th, cruelties, seditions, violence, leagues for undertakings of mutual destruction, usurpations, assassinations, in a word, an enormous assembly of crimes, whose dramatic adaptation would be a play of horrors. If, from the example of Machiavel, one resolved to reverse justice and humanity, one would upset the entire universe. The flood of the crimes would reduce, in double time, this continent to a vast loneliness. It was the iniquity and the cruelty of Italy's princes which made them lose their states, just as the false principles of Machiavel will undoubtedly cause the loss for those which have the madness, or amorality, to follow his lead. I do not disguise anything. The plain cowardice of some of these princes of Italy, when added to their spite, has also contributed to their loss. The weakness of the kings of Naples, it is sure, ruined them. But I also suspect that when it comes to making policy, you can spin all the fine words you want, you can argue, design great systems, plead the most excellent of examples, employ all possible subtleties, but you will be obliged to return to simple justice, in spite of your own self. I request from Machiavel what he means by these words, for the actions of a new prince, meaning a usurper, are watched much more closely than those of an hereditary prince, and when seen to be good are far more effectual than antiquity of blood in gaining men over and attaching them to his cause. For men are more motivated by things present than by things past, and when they find themselves well off as they are, they enjoy their good fortune and seek no further. Does Machiavel suppose that, of two equally valorous and wise men, a whole nation will prefer the usurper to the legitimate prince? Would they pay heed to a sovereign without virtues and a kidnapper valiant, one full with his kind of capacity, and how would they? It may not be that the first assumption is that of the author, for such a theory is opposed to the most elemental notions of a grown citizen's common sense. It would be quite an effect without cause to see a preference in the people that favors a man whose campaigning for the throne is one of plain violence, and has no preferable merit over that of the legitimate sovereign. It could not be the second assumption also, because the same quality of spirit that lets me know what a usurper is when I see one, acknowledges to me that the violent action by which he raises his power is an injustice. What can a person of any station expect from a man who begins with the crime, if not a violent and tyrannical government? It is the same for any man of any rank who marries, and sees on the very same day an infidelity done by his wife. I do not think that such actions give a forecast which predicts that the wife will be virtuous for the remainder of her life, nor does my breadth of knowledge give me this thought. Machiavel pronounces his judgment in this chapter. He says clearly that without the love of the people, the affection of the world, and a well-disciplined army, it is impossible for a prince to be supported on the throne. The truth seems to force its way into him, this homage, with little to separate him from the theologists of the fallen angels who then recognize God while still blaspheming him, the reinvention of the infidel into a heretic. Here is what consists of a contradiction. To gain the affection of the people and the world at large, it is necessary to have funds of virtue, it is necessary that the prince is benevolent, and to have those qualities of the heart in him that give the capacity to discharge the functions of his new load. Shouldering this load is like assuming all others. The men who wish to employ themselves this way never obtain the confidence if they are not just and enlightened. The corrupt man always wishes to be a man of good character, just as those unable to control themselves often prefer to be someone more careful. How in the name of God can it be that the least burgomaster, the least alderman of a town, needs to be an honest man and a hard worker if he wants to keep his rickety seat, but that royalty would be the only position where the one full of vice would be the authority? To gain the subjects' hearts, one must act as I have counseled and not like Machiavel, the teacher. In the course of this work, of injustice, cruelty, raw ambition, and confining one's care to the aid and assistance of one's own hunger for power, his own policy is now uncovered. The policy that let a dangerous man pass for a great one in Machiavel's own century. This century is gone, but his abominable maxims still live. Nobody had answered them in form, they prefer to cover the eyes. From this, many policies follow, ones that have something to hide. Happy would we be that if we could entirely destroy the Machiavellianism in the world. I have shown some of the inconsistencies, but it is up to those who control the world to convince it. They are obliged to cure the public of the false idea that policy, which should be only be a system of wisdom, is nothing more than a house of frauds. It is up to them to banish the complexities and the bad faith of the treaties, and to return the vigor to honesty and frankness, which I need hardly say is a bargain of mutual advantage between the sovereigns. It is for them to show that they are as not the glorious enviers of their neighbors' provinces. Are they not also jealous of the preservation of their own states? The prince that wants it all is like a stomach which wants all the food and drink on the table, that does not think it will be unable to digest them, and in implementing this ambition, vomits. The prince who limits himself to good government is like a man who eats moderately, and whose stomach digests properly. Chapter XXV, How much influence fortune has in the affairs of the world, and how one can resist it. You might want to read chapter 25 of The Prince first. The question about the freedom of man is one of these problems which push the reason of the philosophers to its end, where they often drew from the anathemas of the mouth of the theologians. The partisans of freedom say that, if men's wills are not free, God acts in them, that it is God which, through them, makes the murders, the flights and all the crimes. This is obviously opposed to holiness. In the second place, if supremacy implies being the father of the defects, and the authors of iniquities takes this as the next testament, one will not be able to punish the culprits any more. And there will be neither crimes nor virtues in the world. However, as under no circumstances would anyone think of this dreadful dogma without seeing in it all sorts of contradictions, one could take a better path when declaring oneself for the freedom of man. The partisans of the peremptory necessity of determinism say, on the contrary, that God would be worse than a blind workman, and that he works in the darkness if, after creating the world, he had been unaware of what was to be done there. A clock and watchmaker, they say, knows and can control the action of the least wheel in each of them, since they make the movement that was designed by him, and each goes to its assigned destination, and would God, this infinitely wise being, be a mere witness, curious and impotent, of humanity's actions? How would this same God, whose structures support a whole set of commands and who controls all with certain immutable and constant laws, let any person at all enjoy independence and freedom? If this is so, then it would not be God any more that would control the world, but the whim of the independent and free spirits. Then, it is necessary to choose between the Creator and the creature, which of both is the robot. It is more reasonable to believe that this contradiction is where both our weakness and our power reside. Thus the reason and passions are like invisible chains, by which the hand of Providence leads mankind to contribute to the unfolding of events that, in his eternal wisdom, knows how they conclude, who, were he to arrive in the world, would see that each individual fulfilled his destiny. It is like, by avoiding the whirlpool of Charybdis, one approaches too close to the she-monster. Scylla, the philosophers mutually push themselves into abysmal nonsense, while the theologians work their tight grip in a dark room, and then condemn themselves to be human, and show charity to their fellow creatures. These parties are trapped in a war without victory, like where the Carthaginians and the Romans once found themselves. When Carthage saw the Roman troops in Africa, they carried the torch of the war to Italy, and when Rome wanted to save itself from Hannibal, who was right on their doorstep, they sent Scipio to the head of the legions, and the legions to besiege Carthage. The philosophers, theologians, and the majority of the heroes of the argument, have the genius of the French nation. They attack vigorously, but they are lost if they are reduced to the defensive war, for they cannot defend. This is what makes the beautiful spirit say that God is the father of all religions, since he had given all of them weapons that are similar. Each human being is given their own corner, and only that. This question about the freedom and predestination of man is transported by Machiavel from metaphysics to policy. It is, however, a land which is very foreign for him, one which he seems unable to offer constructive counsel. Because in policy, instead of reasoning if we are free or if we are not, if fortune and chance can do something completely out of the blue, which we humans cannot anticipate, we should only think of improving our penetration and our prudence. Fortune and chance are meaningless words, which all known evidence shows that their source is the times of deep ignorance in which humanity's role in the world was to stagnate, the time when one gave vague names to the effects whose causes were unknown. What is called vulgarly the fortune of Caesar properly means all the human factors which support the plans of the ambitious. What one understands by the misfortune of Cato, for in fact unexpected misfortunes did arrive to him, is a side-swipe where the effects followed the causes so suddenly, the subject's prudence could neither preempt them nor fight them. What is meant by the chance, is nothing more than the roll of the dice, in all its forms. The chance, says one, made my dice yield 12 rather than 7. To break up this phenomenon physically, it would be necessary to have good enough instruments to see precisely the way in which one inserted the dice in the horn, to measure the exact force of all movements of the hand, and that of the hand turning the horn, all of these forces which are transferred to the dice, and their exact quantity. These are the causes which, taken together, we call chance. As long as we are only men, with instruments, senses and minds that are limited, we will never be higher in certain of these areas than what is called the blows of fortune. We must let life rapture us every now and then, and gather what knowledge we can, sometimes randomly, according to events. Even if we were to overcome this chaos, our lives are simply too short for us to see all, and our spirits too narrow to combine them. Clearly, we will all face events which are impossible, even with all the wisdom of humanity as our ally, to envisage. Here is an example of such an event, which caused Cremo to be routed by Prince Eugene. He and his company made a plan with all the prudence conceivable, and carried it out with infinite care. Here is how this design failed. The prince was let into the city at dawn. Traveling through a sewer which was opened to him by a priest with whom he had struck a deal, Cremo would have infallibly become master of the place, had two unexpected things, which he could not know, arrived. Firstly, a Swiss regiment, which was to drill the same morning, had all the weapons that Cremo had concluded were not there, and held him back until the remainder of the garrison was assembled. In the second place, the guide who was to let in the forces of the Prince de Vaudemont had a pass key to the city, which was to be given to Cremo, missed the agreed-upon path, with the result that this detachment arrived too late. The second event which I want to use to illuminate, is that of a particular peace that the English made with France towards the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. Neither the ministers for the Emperor Joseph, nor the greatest philosophers, nor the most skillful statesmen, could have suspected that a pair of gloves would change the boundary drawing of Europe. This, however, happened literally. The Duchess of Marlborough had the position of Grand Mistress of Queen Anne in London, while her husband won in the campaigns of the Brabant a double harvest of laurels and riches. This Duchess supported by her favor the party of the hero, and the hero supported the credit of his wife by his victories. The Tory party, which was opposed to them, and which wished peace, could not do anything while the Duchess was so close to the ear of the Queen. She lost this favor by a cause that was frivolous. The Queen had a pair of gloves, and the Duchess had the same brand at the same time. Her impatience to have them made her urge the glove-check man to serve her before the Queen. Anne, however, wanted to have her gloves too. A lady, Mrs. Machiavelli, who was enemy of Milady Marlborough, informed the Queen of all that had occurred, and dwelled on it with such an amount of malignity, the Duchess went from that moment from the Queen's favourite to an indolent, not worthy of Her Majesty's support any more. The glove-keeper completed the undermining of this princess by telling Anne the history of the gloves, which he spun with all possible blackness. This simple pettiness was sufficient to put all opinions in fermentation, and to season all that must accompany a disgrace. The Tories, with the Marshal of Tallard at their head, prevailed in this change of court, which became a laurel of their own. The Duchess of Marlborough was disgraced a short time afterwards, and with her fell the Whig party, and that of the Emperor's allies. Such is the playpen of events, which sets the stage for the most serious things of the world, and Providence laughs at the wisdom and greatness of the highest man. Frivolous and sometimes ridiculous causes often change the fortune of the states and of whole monarchies. In this occasion, the cattiness of women saved Louis XIV from a step which even his wisdom and his power could not prevent a possible downfall, and obliged his allies to make peace in spite of him. These whirlpools of events arrive, but I can freely confess that they occur seldom, and that their transcendence of humanity is not sufficient to discredit prudence and penetration. They are like diseases which sometimes ravage the health of men, but who do not prevent them from enjoying, most of the time, the advantages of a robust temperament. It is thus necessary that those which must control the world, must also cultivate their penetration and their prudence, but it is not sufficient, because if they want to captivate fortune, it is necessary that they learn how to fold their temperament when fate has the higher hand, which is very difficult. I speak in general only about two basic kinds of temperament, that of a bold promptness, and that of a circumspect slowness, and as these moral causes may have an organic cause, it is almost impossible for a prince to be so strong a master of himself that he can display all colors, like a chameleon. Centuries ago, the Times supported the glory of the conquerors, and of these bold men and enterprisers who seem born to implement extraordinary changes in the universe, the revolutions and the wars. I do not know which spirits of giddiness and distrust confuse the sovereigns, and provide a conqueror the occasions to benefit from their quarrels. There never was a Fernando Cortés who, in the conquest of his Mexico, was not supported by a civil war of the Native Americans. Other times, when the world was less agitated, it appeared to want to be governed only by mildness, or it made necessary that prudence and circumspection be used. It is a species of happy calm in the policy, one which usually succeeds the storm. This is when the negotiations are more effective than the battles, and then it is necessary to gain by the pen what one could not acquire by the sword. For a sovereign to benefit from all these different situations, it would be necessary that he learned to conform to time like a skillful pilot. If a general were both bold and circumspect, by the way, he would be almost untamable. Fabius undermined Hannibal by the patience of his campaigns. This Roman did not ignore the continued deficits of the Carthaginians, of money and recruits, and that without fighting it was enough to see Hannibal's army quietly melt away, to make it perish, so to speak, of hemophilia. The policy of Hannibal, so contrary to Fabius, required fighting. His power was only from force of accident, so it was necessary to seize with all speed every possible advantage. He could only consolidate through terror of his actions both brilliant and sharp, and by the resources which he drew from his conquests. In the year 1704, if the Elector of Bavaria and the Marshal of Tallard had not left Bavaria to pounce on Blenheim and Hochstedt, they would have kept under control all of Suab, because the Electors and Marshals' allied forces were not able to remain in Bavaria because they lacked food. They would have been obliged to withdraw themselves towards Mai, and to separate. It was the lack of circumscription, which the Elector instinctively trusted at the height of any battle, which will be remembered with shame for the German nation, which depended on him to preserve it. This imprudence was punished by the total defeat of Frucuaeus and the Bavarians, and by the loss of Bavaria itself, and of all this country which is between the top of the Palatinate and the Rhine. One usually does not speak about the bold ones which fortune has favored with a liquidation. One speaks only about those which were assisted by fortune. It is like dreams and prophecies. Between the 1,000 which were false and that one forgets, one recalls the chosen few which unfolded correctly. The world should judge effects by their causes, and not of the causes by their effects. I thus conclude that a people risks much with a bold prince, that he is a continual danger, which, one way or another, threatens them. The circumspect sovereign, even though he is not cut out for the great exploits, seems born for the administration of good government. The first ventures, but the other preserves. All species of great men need to have the winds of time blowing in their favor, without which all their talents are more crippling than advantageous for them. Any reasonable man, and mainly those which the spirit has molded to control others, should make a plan of control as well reasoned and as bounded as a geometrical demonstration, to follow their system in all circumstances. Always keep it as the base of their subsequent actions, and never to deviate from their goal. Using this, they could spring back from setbacks and bad luck, from the routing of their plans, and would also help others to carry out the projects which they themselves might have achieved, for the good of their state. But who are these princes for whom we claim the double talent? They will be only men, and the winds of history will show, truly and plainly, that it is impossible for these favored ones to satisfy as many duties that they think they can. Even these gems among rulers will be dragged down to. It is better to be ruled by the mythical phoenix, and or the unifier with the spirit of a metaphysician, than by the philosopher, king of Plato. It is right that the people are satisfied with the efforts of honest sovereigns who try for perfection and fail. The most accomplished of them will be those which will move away more than the others from the Prince of Machiavel, and his ideal of the philosopher liar. It is right that the typical subject supports their ruler's defects when they are counterbalanced by his qualities of the heart, and by good intentions and character. We are obligated to remember, without a failure of our own heart, that there is no one perfect in the world, and that error and weakness are shared by all people. The happiest country is that where this mutual forgiveness and charity between the sovereign and his subjects spread this softness onto the country, without which lives are weighed down by a load which grows imperceptibly heavier with time, until the world becomes a valley of bitternesses, and not a theatre of joys. Chapter XXVI, Various kinds of diplomatic negotiations and reasons which gives one the right to make war. You might want to read chapter 26 of The Prince first. We have seen in this work the falseness of the reasoning by which Machiavel claimed to give us the keys to change, by presenting to us degenerates, plain criminals who know well how to wear the masks of great men. I made my efforts to tear off this veil of virtue which exposes the face of a skull, in which Machiavel has wrapped it, and for defabulating the world of error which so many people inhabit. Concerning the policy of princes, I said to the kings that their best policy consists of exceeding their subjects in virtue, so as to eliminate as much as possible the rust of hypocrisy, to stop condemning in others what they authorize for themselves. I said that it was not enough to bring brilliant actions to the world to establish their reputation, but that it is necessary for these actions to tend to the happiness of mankind. I add to this two other discussions of principle, a glance at the negotiations of diplomacy, and war, specifically, what kind one can, to the eyes of God, call justified. The prince's foreign ministers and diplomats are privileged spies, who take care to influence or even control the sovereigns to whom they are sent. They must penetrate the foreign rulers' intentions, look further into their steps, and envisage their actions in order to inform their masters of them in time. The principal object of their mission is to reinforce the links of goodwill between the sovereigns, but instead of being the peacemakers, they are often the agents of war. They employ the flattery, tricks and seductions, to tear off the secrecies of the state they are into their fellow ministers at home. They win the weak ones over by their statements, the proud ones by words that soothe, and the interested parties by their gifts. It is true that they sometimes act as if their only restraint is what they can get away with. This is because they sometimes have to sin to win, and they are thus assured impunity. While on foreign soil, the best protection against the artifices of these spies, whom the princes must take in, is just rule. When the subject of the negotiation becomes more significant, this is where the princes have the greatest need to supervise and review the conduct of their ministers, in order to see that some rain of tides does not erode the power of their virtue. In these times of crisis, when alliances are treated, it is necessary that the prudence of the sovereigns is more vigilant than it has been in ordinary times. It is necessary that they dissect with close attention the nature of the things which they are promising, so that they can meet their engagements. For the diplomat, faithful as he is to the interests of his country, is at his least restrained during these times. A treaty must be considered in all its phases, all its consequences must be deduced, and all other actions which would satisfy its spirit, if only approximately, should be considered. What appears to be a real advantage, is often upon close examination a sop, which could encourage the ruin of the state. It is necessary to add to these precautions taking great care to clear up any ambiguous terms. The use of a fussy and fastidious drafter must always precede the policy, so that a fraudulent distinction of the word and the spirit of the treaty cannot take place. In policy, one should make a list of all the faults which the other princes show when pressured for the use of those who want to make treaties or alliances, and try to guess at the time when it would be necessary to communicate with them in writing, when they need the time and the calm to make reflections, which could only benefit them. This tends to be better than a railroading, followed by a payback. Negotiations are not for all accredited ministers. One often sends people of poor character into lands of more fluid custom, where they have to make deals with more flexibility, and them yielding to the pressure brings fewer penalties. These are the kind of deals that, if cut by the master himself, would make his usual negotiating partners wonder if a precedent is being set. The preliminaries of the last peace between the Emperor and France were concluded in this manner, with only the seal of the Empire being affixed to the treaty, with the maritime forces attending. This compromise was done in the residence of a count, the Comte de Uwid, whose grounds are at the edge of the Rhine. Victor Amédée, the most skillful prince and most cunning of his time, knew better than anybody how to dissimulate his intentions. Europe was deceived more than once by the smoothness of his tricks. In the midst of all the treaty forging, he met the Marshal of Cacciat, wearing the frock of a monk, and under pretext of doing the Lord's work, withdrew Cacciat from the Emperor's negotiating table, and made a convert to the work of King Louis out of him. This negotiation between the king and the general was led with as much dexterity as the alliance of France and of Savoy which followed, and appeared to the eyes of Europe like a phenomenon of unexpected and extraordinary policy. This is here not to justify the conduct of Victor Amédée there, nor does this single example show this man's character. he has done much else. I only wish to highlight his skill and discretion, which, if it is used for an honest end, are absolutely necessary qualities in a sovereign. It is a general rule that a prince should choose the spirits that are of a more refined character for employment in difficult negotiations. He cannot staff his foreign services only with the crafty ones. With talent for intrigue and the flexibility of the weak, the only general qualifications are a talent for reading from the guises of others the secrecies of their heart, so that nothing escapes their penetration, and that all is discovered by the force of reasoning, not by flashes of artistry. One should not misuse the tricks and the smoothness, they are like handymen. Too frequent use of them blunts your own head, and leaves you dependent on men who, at bottom, are motivated largely by self-regard, and expect you to be, too. Property, on the contrary, is useful for all times. It is similar to appliances that are simple and near indestructible, which are adequate for most tasks, and, if they break down at all, are easier to figure out. A prince whose frankness is both proven and known, will earn the confidence of Europe. Infallibly, he will be happy without cheating, and powerful through the path of peace. The good will that will take root in his state will be like a town square, where all the paths of policy must meet. This must be the goal of all his maneuvers. The peace of Europe is based mainly on the maintenance of the wise balance of power, by which the higher force of a monarchy is counterbalanced by the joined-together power of some other sovereigns. If this balance had suddenly tipped, there would be real fear that it heralded a universal revolution, and that a new empire will be forged on the remains of the princes whose disunion would make too weak to resist. The policy of the princes of Europe thus seems to require of them that they never neglect alliances and the treaties by which they can equalize the forces of an ambitious power, and they must be wary of those which want to foster among them the disunion and discord. One must remember this consul who, to show how much the union was necessary, took a horse by the tail, and made useless efforts for tearing it off the beast, but when he plucked away hair by hair after separating them, the horse was easily deplumed. This lesson is as clear for certain sovereigns nowadays as for the Roman legiores. It is only their union which can make them formidable, and to maintain in Europe peace and tranquility. This was written around the year 1740, DMR. The world would be happier if their means other than that of the negotiations to maintain justice, and to restore peace and good harmony between the nations. One would employ reason instead of weapons, and one would use the code of the debater rather than that of the cutthroat. Meeting plain aggression requires the princes to have recourse to means that are even more aggressive. There are occasions where it is necessary to defend by weapons the freedom of the people against those who want to oppress them by injustice. It is sometimes necessary to obtain by anger what iniquity refuses to mildness, where the sovereigns must stick up for their nation through battles. It is in these particular cases which the paradox, that a good war makes for a good peace, becomes true. It is now time to discuss war, and what makes one just or unjust. Passions and the ambition of the princes often blur the eyesight to the difference, and paint in the most advantageous colors actions that are simply violent. War is always a last resort, thus, one should make use of it only with precaution and with a feeling of despair, and after a thorough examination as to whether one is carried there by an illusion of pride, or by a reason that is solid and essential. There are defensive wars, and these are the closest to justice, provided that they are really defensive. There are wars of interest that the kings are obliged to make, to uphold rights that are being questioned. They plead their case with weapons in hand, and the engagements tend to decide the validity of their reasons. There are wars of precaution that princes are sometimes wise to undertake. They are offensive with regard to the truth, but they are not the less right. When the excessive size of a power seems close to overflowing, and threatens to absorb the universe, it is prudence to throw sandbags at it, and to stop the stormy course of a torrent while one is still the master. One sees clouds which gather together a storm which is forming, and the flashes which announce it, and the sovereign that this danger threatens, not being able to entreat the storm, will meet, if he is wise, this storm measure for measure. If the kings of Egypt, of Syria, of Macedonia, had banded together against the Roman power, they would still never have been able to upset these empires, but a wisely concerted alliance, and a war quickly undertaken, would have deflated Rome's ambitious designs to conquer the universe. Self-defense was the most that these powers could hope for. It is prudent to prefer the least evils to the greater, as to choose the trustworthy partner over that which is dubious. It is thus better that if a prince engages in an offensive war, when he is the master, to choose deliberately between the branch of olive and that of the laurel, that he waits until the despairing point, or that a declaration of offensive war is the only thing standing between him and slavery, and his ruin. It is an unquestionable maxim, that it is better to prevent than be prevented. The great men are always good at spotting an imminent fight, and responding by a surgical use of their forces before their enemies implemented plans that would bind their hands and destroy their capacity to retaliate when war becomes open. Alliances, as there are none in Europe which can support themselves by their own forces, so they are committed to giving each other mutual help where necessary. This contributes both to their security and to their conservation. The particular event decides which ally draws from the treasury of the alliance. Sometimes an ally gets exactly what they want, other times, they have to settle for a consolation disbursement. Honesty, and the wisdom of the world, requires them also to observe them the faith of the treaties they signed with almost religious devotion. What keeps them inside is the knowledge that they achieve more of their goals through alliances, which make the princes' protection of their people even more effective. All of these wars, the purpose of which will be only to push back usurpers, to maintain legitimate rights, to guarantee the freedom of the world, and to euchre out the oppressions and violences of the ambitious, will be in conformity with justice. The sovereigns who undertake these ones do not have to reproach themselves over the blood that will be shed, the need makes them act, and in similar circumstances the war is a lesser misfortune than the peace. This subject naturally leads me to speak about the princes who, by a kind of bargaining known to antiquity, adulterate the blood of their people. Their heart cries like an auctioneer whose troops are sold to those who offer the highest subsidies. The reason and justification for the soldier is for the defense of the fatherland, to rent them out to others, as one would sell mastiffs and bulls for combat, perverts at the same time the goals of trade and war, so it appears to my eyes. It is said that one is not allowed to sell the things necessary to health. What then makes it permissible to sell the blood of the men? Do you hear? Wars of religion, if in fact they are civil wars, are almost always the continuation of the sovereign's imprudence by other means, a prince who clumsily supported a sect at the expense of a more deserving other, or involved the government too much in the exercise of religion, to the point where differences of conscience begin to resemble the quarrels of the parties, in what is at stake in these disputes. Blending exercise and defense of the faith with defending one's rights and doing one's duty in the state produces sparks that should die out on their own, but which the sovereign, in guiding them to the political stream, is also guiding towards the tinder pile. To maintain the strength of the civil government, to leave with each subject the freedom of their own conscience, to be always a king and to never play the priest, are the surest means of preserving the state which he is charged with ruling from the storms which the dogmatic spirit of the theologians always seeks to excite. I need hardly discuss what mixing men of state and men of the churches will lead to. The foreign wars of religion are the highest height of injustice and nonsense. To leave Arch, to go to convert Saxon with iron in hand like Charlemagne, or to equip a fleet and send them to the Sultan of Egypt to turn him Christian, are quite strange apologetics. The fury of the Crusades is princes engage in wars for their allies, by living up to their treaties, in consequence of which they were obliged to provide a number of auxiliary troops. No sovereign can do without. Past, God grant that it never returns. In general, war is the second worst misfortune a prince can experience. It is the policy with the most uncertain result, and its continuation is so ruinous for a country, that the princes cannot reflect enough before declaring one. Violences which the troops commit in an enemy country, are nothing in comparison to the misfortunes which boomerang directly on the states of the princes who enter them into war. It is so serious an act and so consequential to undertake it. I am simply astonished that so many kings took the use of war as an appropriate means of conflict resolution so lightly. I am convinced that if the monarchs of all ages could be visited by a ghost carrying a table of miseries, one that is true and faithful to all facts, which plagues the people as the result of one declaration of war, they would not be so insensitive to these consequences. Their imagination is not keen enough to represent to them the naturalness, the old Adam quality, of the evils which they know nothing of, from which they were sheltered from. How will they themselves feel these evils which overpower the people? The deprivation of the youth of the country, the ones whose names and perhaps numbers appear on the recruiting lists. The contagious diseases which defoliate the armies. The horror of the battles, and of these sieges where seeing wide-eyed skeletons in the keep is a sign that you are winning. The ravages of the casualties that enemy iron deprived of some of their members, the instruments of their industry and of their subsistence. How about the breakdowns of the orphans who lost, by the death of their father, the single support and protection of their weakness? Not to mention the loss of men that are useful for the state, the ones that are harvested by death before their time. The princes who are in the world to make their subjects happy, should think this over thoroughly before tearing, out of frivolous and vain causes, the door off of hell, and freeing all that humanity has to fear. The sovereigns who see their subjects as their slaves use them without pity, and see them perish without regret, but the princes who consider themselves to be the first among men that are at bottom equal, and who consider the people as the body of which they are the soul, spare the blood of their subjects. I request that any sovereigns who are finishing this work do not take offense at the degree of freedom with which I speak to them. My goal is to say the truth, to inspire with virtue, and not to flatter anybody. The good opinion that I have of the princes who reign presently in the world makes me see them as worthy to hear the truth. It is the Nero, the Alexander VI, the Caesar Borgia, the Louis XI, to whom I would not dare to say it. Thanks to Providence, we do not have such men among the princes of Europe, and there is no better praise than to say that one is confident enough to indict, in front of them, all the defects which degrade royalty, and which are contrary with the sentiments of humanity and justice.